Now, South Africa has become the first African country to legalize cannabis for personal use. The move comes after President Cyril Ramaphosa gave his final approval on May 28th. Now, the Cannabis for Private Purpose Act marks the removal of it from the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act, which now ensures consumption without the risk of prosecution. The legalization also directs that everyone who has been convicted for marijuana use should have the criminal records expunged. The move aims to safeguard children from undue exposure to cannabis and its possession by minors. Experts say lawful cannabis industry could contribute between 6 to 25 billion rand to South Africa's economy. In Europe, similar regulatory formulas have been adopted by Belgium and more recently Germany. In Asia as well, countries like Thailand have decriminalized the cultivation, distribution and marketing and consumption of marijuana.
In a historic move, South Africa has become the first African country to legalize cannabis use. Adults can now use, consume or possess cannabis for their personal consumption without the risk of prosecution. The legalization also directs that everyone who has been convicted for marijuana use should have their criminal records wiped clean automatically. Experts say lawful cannabis industry could contribute between 6 to 25 billion rand to South Africa's GDP. The legalization of cannabis, particularly for medicinal purposes, is gaining momentum worldwide. Countries like Thailand have decriminalized the cultivation, distribution, marketing and consumption of cannabis. In Europe, similar regulatory formulas have been adopted by Malta, Belgium and more recently Germany. This is Kalden Omo from Johannesburg, South Africa for WION World is One.
The reason that we had the ruling, the 2018 ruling initially is to provide for consumption without harassment, without it being a criminal offense. And within that, there is this very obvious, part of, the situation that we are doing all of this, going to all this effort, arguing it in court, because people consume cannabis, and then the question is, where do they get it? People generally buy this. It's because we have to police cannabis, right? Before, so now suddenly it's not like that's going to fall away. It is a way that the state is in some ways trying to again limit the use of cannabis as it falls under a drug status. So but that's again because of other national policies like the national drug master plan and other policies within the Department of Social Development, for example. So because the onus is on the state to regulate and maintain order in a certain way, unless we challenge those perspectives, we'll be sitting with the same interpretation of, this and that is a drug and this is how we act or intervene in case of, what we term is abuse and so on. So it's an ideological issue and it's a governance framework issue at the end of the day.
So that kind of leads into you must tell me if I'm jumping the gun now, but cannabis being removed from the Drugs Trafficking Act. Can we touch on that a little bit? What does that mean, and how will that be implemented?
Okay, well, I think it's quite a positive move, and it adds great significance, I would say, since cannabis is obviously now completely removed from the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act of '92, and it allows for pending national legislation to dovetail into provisions within the Private Purposes Act. So, like I said before, it allows for hemp production and trade, if one holds the required permits and so on, which are not expensive. It's more, having the knowledge of being a farmer and so on that comes into it, so access to land, support and all of that, that's going to cost you money, but it's for all intents and purposes, it's quite open now. And it also opens up the potential to set up a local medicinal distribution pathway that is obviously based on the grey area interpretation of Section 21 in the Medicines Act at the moment, so which is a mechanism that has been completely abused. So it would be nice to see something more official there that helps to negate, the disparity that exists in entering the market and so on, because there's a lot of organized criminal network factors that play into this because of this grey area exploitation. There's just a lot of asymmetries, actually, which is probably a dense discussion in and of itself. So Just to mention in terms of the medical route, I do have my reservations about the potential Trojan horse that this move represents, right? Because by legitimizing medicinal and industrial cannabis segments without formal plans to enable the adult use pathway, we will likely see further socioeconomic disparity, as many legacy producers, including rural, peri-urban and urban farmers, continue to be sidelined while the expensive business models and practices get the green light. So for those who can afford it and who may be politically connected or so on. Again, this is a dense topic and it needs quite a bit more time to focus on and unpack. But yeah, I would like to see civil society continue to mobilize and push for enabling an adult use pathway, because it's ultimately one of the reasons, again, that we got the ruling, I feel. And you might be able to interpret it any which way you like if you just get down to the black and white letters on the paper. But we all know what this really is about. And in terms of serving, and that's more about compassion. Again, it's not about law. It's about using the law, hopefully, and moving towards a human rights and compassion-based approach to what people's needs really are in terms of governance again. So
I think it is quite essential also, this form of public participation we're getting with clubs, pushing the boundaries to create more of an accessible barrier to entry for the small guys on the field, especially in terms of like our rural farmers and our heritage legacy farmers, Whereas now, like the licensed facilities, you need big financial input to get going on that. But I think it's important for us to kind of, in this point in time, test those boundaries and push those boundaries so that we can create a framework that does include the small guys, And that's the whole objective of this as well, so that, as you say, that they don't get left behind, because they've been the ones that have been working with the plants like for centuries and that carry all the knowledge. So I think it's quite crucial that we do what we do and push the boundaries to create a framework that does include them and doesn't have these hectic barriers to entry.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I would just add to that the knowledge that people hold in terms of cultivating cannabis, it's so diverse, right? Because cannabis has now, I mean, it's been cultivated for centuries, but say in the context of South Africa, we've got at least a century's worth of interesting history with regards to, well, also through legal interpretations and the need to regulate it in which or whatever way according to state ideology again. But from that, we've seen a very diverse range of cultivation approaches. I mean, prohibition essentially drove cannabis cultivation indoors in many many first world or European countries. South Africa also implemented that, because that's again a new cultivation method that allows you to exploit so much from the plant, right? Because you can cultivate, select firstly for phenotypes that work in your favor to produce more THC, because that's what the consumer wants, right? Supposedly. And then you drive up the THC, you drive down all sorts of other cannabinoids or organic volatile compounds that might, diminish the effect of the high, even though it's not necessarily what we're looking for. We realize some of that now, but that's again a different conversation. But in that, we see diverse practices among rural, peri-urban, and urban farmers again. So there's lots of knowledge that can be shared again from I think kind of high-tech contexts, and see how we can implement that in terms of communities' willingness and ability again to adopt those practices where it makes sense for them, and to have that knowledge transfer, and skills transfer as a broader conversation within how we approach development. So it's actually an empowerment thing, because my issue with this is that we can't just take this commodity that many communities have relied on for decades and just say, okay, well, as a state, we are now going to industrialize this resource, and we're doing it according to this and that model and so on. and this is the approach we're taking, because that's what happens normally when any kind of issue enters the the state's purview, is that they will exercise their so-called responsibility according to frameworks that are set up because they are meant to be checks and balances. But the inhumanity that again enters if you use that as a default without really considering the human aspect of that, it completely fails in its purpose to be governance for the people, and hopefully to a degree by the people also, as much as we try and shift that burden to the state, it would be nice to be more active in democracy, more broadly speaking, as I think, well, for society to be more actively engaged in that, because then we might see less of these, issues where governments just kind of steamroll over the needs of citizens. But yeah, with regards to that, I think it's a difficult thing because there's so many, I think, different challenges, right? Overlapping challenges also within the different, I would say, producer and user communities in South Africa. So a rural farmer's needs, for example, would not be the same as a peri-urban or an urban farmer. An urban farmer might be able to, they might just be supplementing their income and they have other skills and knowledge and so on, experience to fall back on if this falls away. But what happens to a rural farmer, right? For example, or some of our rural farmers, we've seen what happens there in the last couple of years since the privacy judgment, that they've not really been able to sell cannabis like they have before. So, and there's an interesting article that I read on that, where I think it was published in 2003 already, right? A study that was done in the Eastern Cape area to just illustrate how much the illicit status of cannabis was connected to its commodity value, right? And since we've seen that change, the commodity value of cannabis has, it's changed significantly. The price it's fallen significantly, and it's affecting everybody. But normally, the people at the bottom are the most affected. Again, so it's because we're not working on equal footing, still.
That leads very nicely into the next question, Etienne. These members of these communities that have always been working with the plant and doing it through illicit trade, a lot of them had to face criminal charges. So within this bill or this act, a big part of it also is the expungement of criminal records. Can you just give us some detail around that and how that works?
Sure, yeah. The Act says that expungements should be automatic, but we know how dysfunctional administration in South Africa can be at times. So I would recommend that if you think you or someone else may be eligible for expungement of a criminal record, seek legal advice to get the process started. And again, here, not all will be eligible either. So only individuals that were prosecuted for use and possession based on presumption of dealing are eligible, not people that have been convicted where a clear case of dealing was the outcome. And the reason for this is that the Act as it stands now does not provide for the decriminalization of dealing in cannabis.
Yes,
so hence
absolutely.
those prosecutions need to stand logically. Otherwise, it would contravene or
absolutely contradict
defeat the ends of justice or whatever. So this remains, in my view, a human rights issue. And I don't believe that anybody should go to prison for selling cannabis. But again, it's contextual, and it's not as simple as just saying this or that, because we live in a democratic society where it's not just cannabis users that have a say in this, and there's so much stigma that we need to work through as well. And I think alleviating that and through public education, we might be able to, in time, sway public opinion and perspective on this. But it's going to be, it's going to be a journey.
You can already see it happening, even from authority side. Police is a lot less aggressive towards these kind of cases. If you compare that to in the past, like pre-2017, it's as if it's relaxed a lot, and because of the plant now being more like in a public domain, whereas people that have in the past not really had clear access to the knowledge or didn't have direct interactions with the communities. Whereas now that's a little bit more accessible through clubs and through social media and all that. It's definitely as if we are definitely moving in the direction of destigmatization. I mean, like even old tannies that were in the past opposed to cannabis, now they're experimenting to test it out for certain ailments and getting a little bit more faith in the plant. So I think we definitely headed in that direction, and legislation plays a massive role in that, because people don't want to disobey the law. People don't want to act as criminals. So if the laws kind of create an easier pathway, that definitely aids in the destigmatization as well. I think the big thing now is just the big priority is creating means of how do people access this plant, because we've got the right now to cultivate it and to consume it in private, but how are we going to obtain that if we can go to jail for 10 years by selling the plant, so that's the big barrier now that we have to cross and sort of just figure out. This bill also focuses highly on the protection of children. Can we just go a bit into detail on that, and what does the bill say around the cannabis and children, going to not smoke in front of children and all those kind of things? Can you just give us a little bit of an outline there?
Yeah, so it does speak to protections of children. So I would again argue that it's a sound requirement, to prevent abuses of children, broadly speaking. And again, we will have to test the system, but provisions where it clashes maybe with some traditional contexts. I would say there are provisions in terms of IKA's policy and law, as well as Traditional Health Practitioners Act. And where there are these potential infringements, again, it would be something that the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs would have to, I think, do a bit of work alongside civil society to assist in teasing out the details, since a clear roadmap for that obviously does not exist yet. But yeah, I believe enough policy and legislation exists to build a protective mechanism for traditional use, which then again protects children and adults in that context, because obviously again it's sort of to intervene where adults might be abusing children. It's not, the amendments. Well, firstly, the Child Act and the Child and Justice Act actually does consider, the aspect of criminality around children, and at what point, what age, a child can be prosecuted, and so on. And that's also been extended, or it's been amended in recent regulations, and it was specifically looked at because of it's sort of been building, but cannabis was being decriminalized was kind of a last nail in the coffin for needing to really check the regulations around that. The ages have been amended, and I think it's now up until 14 years. You need to look at how you intervene in those situations. So a child can no longer go, to jail or be subject to criminal prosecutions up until the age of 14 is the definition. And, we need to look for the least invasive option, which is either to do nothing, which is the final clause in describing that, or a whole bunch of other steps, which include things like, contacting a responsible adult if there's no such option, then, child services will need to intervene. But at least we've got some protections where children cannot be simply prosecuted for, being goaded into dealing in substances, including cannabis, for example. And then again, from the other side, it's a difficult one again, because we're working from a legal perspective here that is based again in a Western perspective, right? This form of law it's a colonial construct. We need to acknowledge that, right? So hence me sort of jumping in by saying, in terms of the problematics of cultural uses, there are at least these instruments, like IKA's policy and other laws that will help to clarify that over time. But it's not something that's just de facto going to be there. We're going to have to, unfortunately, test these processes, and it's going to require people getting into trouble and then having the means to defend themselves and so on and so on. So I would say as a community, it's one of those things that we really need to focus on and put our energy towards in terms of assisting not just those individuals, but the broader cause, so we can ultimately avoid those kinds of negative situations where children and cannabis and the law intersect. Because I again would just say, I mean, the evidence of harms for cannabis is it's pretty clear already, and I don't think it's necessarily harmful, But again, I wouldn't say that children should just be able to access cannabis either.
Yeah.
So it's, but again, those protections are provided for in the Act again. So children are able, obviously, to use cannabis under supervision of an adult and with medical prescription. So there needs to be, again, some checkboxes that are, sort of fulfilled in order to enable that. What that looks like in terms of traditional law, again, it's a bit of a different story. But again, like I said, I think there are adequate policies and legislation to facilitate those processes, to allow for the integrity of customary law and, IKS Just to add like a final thought to that, just to sort of sum it up, I guess it's not great that we have to do this in terms of, protections for children, but it's the nature of an industrialized society again. So ultimately, I feel that we do need to decolonize governance architecture, practical step by practical step, as the need arises and serves justice and sustainable development for all South Africans, and this is a long-term goal. And I feel like working in the research space, focusing on cannabis in the last couple of years has definitely highlighted the need for that in a different way, because, cannabis is such it's used by a diverse amount of cultures. It's not just something that it belongs to one or the other, kind of a traditional practice or whatever. It's shared across South African society. And that being the case, we need to look at fairer and more humane ways of intervening in these situations.
Okay, and that's the purpose of the entire act, is to work in that direction, to just kind of lay the foundation so that we can look at it more humanely and have more just laws for when it comes to children. In terms of the quantities, there's no quantities prescribed by this act. And I remember you mentioning last time a mechanism put in place to more clearly define that. Can you just briefly explain to us how that will work or what that means?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we've come quite a ways for those that were actually engaging in the public feedback sessions in Parliament regarding plant counting and quantities. As of the 3rd of May enactment of May, of the bill, plant counting and quantities have been removed for the time being, and replaced with a separate mechanism for regulating quantities. So just to speak to this mechanism, this has pros and cons, so it allows for adjustment both up and down through this provision. And here again, public participation, hopefully not, but very likely further litigation also will be required. So I think it's Section 6 of the Act where this regulatory power is written in for the minister to be able to amend regulations that speak to quantities. So that would be also, I think it's mentioned in the section on transport, right? So to say you can only transport X amount of cannabis. Again, the reasoning for that is something I would like to hear from the state. They would need to, in my view, also provide defensible evidence for why that's the route that they're taking. Because again, it to me is based on the harms quantum, right? And if you compare that to other substances that we popularly like to use, like tobacco and alcohol, I would argue that because you're allowed to transport X amount of alcohol or cigarettes or whatever, it should be viewed relative also to those substances if it's about harm and not just protecting industry, because that's another side of it that does play into it. I've heard this perspective from a number of people that introducing limitations on quantities is also a way to create a lever for trade. Because again, if you can't buy, if you can't grow the amount of cannabis that you need for personal use, you will then be required to purchase it from somewhere, right?
Yes.
So that is the mechanism to stimulate industry. Now, whether one agrees with this or not, it is one of those things that I think governments do employ in terms of policy instrumentation to either guide or guard or stimulate industry. Yeah, as for now, it's open, but I know that there's also regulations being formulated at this point, and we will see that published in a Gazette for comments. And I would recommend that people do formulate their responses carefully and formalize it as well in a way that fits with the format of interaction, so it gets the proper recognition that it needs in those parliamentary proceedings, because it's very important, I think, for the public to participate. And again, use evidence as far as you can to illustrate why this is your opinion, and do ask the state what it is that they're basing their proposed framework on, because we deserve to know that.
Yeah,
we rightfully are able to request that information.
Yeah, because it is to exercise our basic rights, Okay, so we don't have much left. I just want to ask you, in terms of transport, what does the Act say around transport? Are we allowed to transport cannabis now, or wat sê die bil van dit?
So as I touched on earlier with the quantities and proposed regulations, currently one may transport any amount, but this will probably change in due course as the minister provides additional regulations. Again, here I see potential issues if the limited amounts one may transport do not correlate with the upper limits to be set for cultivation, processed cannabis. So, I mean, if one needs to suddenly move house or, whatever extraneous reason may cause one to need to transport larger than usual quantities of cannabis, will you require a permit or something silly like that? I personally hope we don't see arbitrary limitations for cultivation again, for private purposes, obviously, but that's, again, a whole other topic. But as for now, there are no limitations on amounts, but there is language that does allow us to transport cannabis, which I know is also a significant thing for cannabis clubs, because before there was that technicality of, okay, private cannabis, but how do you get it from, cultivation site to the club?
Exactly.
So there is definitely a protection built into that, and something that I feel any clubs that might be watching this should consider in terms of, for their, protection of themselves and their members, include in their operational, policies, basically.
Yes. No, thanks for that, Etienne. I think we've covered about everything. You can let me know if as ons enigiets uitgemis het. I just want to kind of conclude this conversation I want to by asking you, like, what's the next step from here? What's the future looking like? Are we now waiting for a cannabis, for a commercial bill, or how's it looking forward from here? Now that we've waited 6 years for this act, it's now been signed by the president. Now what's the next step?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball, right? I go on, what information I can find out there and conversations I'm able to have. But as far as my knowledge goes, next steps would include national legislation to enable industrial and medicinal pathways. Probably lots of medicinal weed shops will pop up, for sure. And as I say to everybody, be careful who you support, since you're allowing others to directly build their lobby funds for less beneficial architecture, right, with regards to socio-economic and restorative justice implications, if you're actually using cannabis and support using cannabis for recreational or adult use purposes, right? So don't I know a lot of people do this, but don't go for I get a medical card, so I'm safe now. And I know it seems like an easy way out, but it's ultimately disingenuous, right? Mm-hmm. If we want to really have the freedoms that we expect the state, to give us in terms of what we understand responsible use to be, and the relative harms of cannabis, which are again not as significant as other recreationally available and regulated substances. Yes, put your money where your ideals are, and okay. I'm not saying don't use medicinal weed if you need it. That's for sure a legitimate pathway. But if it's for recreational use, let's try and avoid the situation we saw happen in California, where everybody had a medical access card, but they were using cannabis for recreational purposes, right? Yes. Let's try and fight for the proper pathways to be set in place, because ultimately that means our rights will be protected, and we will be able to, through that, include harm reduction policies and human rights-based policies in terms of cannabis, which sets the road forward for other plant substances and substances in general, to be more human rights based too. So with regards to policy for a whole Plant Purposes Act, I've been told that it's about 2 to 3 years away. So that would be where adult use would be included, alongside what's already earmarked for development at the moment in the sector. So again, there's work to be done, and I would recommend that civil society keeps chipping away at this, in a logical, methodical manner, because it's the only language the state really understands. But do it with kindness, do it with compassion, and do it with community building in mind, because that's what we really need is cohesion going forward, for broader, I think, benefits for everybody.
That's an extremely valid point, Etienne. So, as you said last time, you're basically voting with your money. You can decide, do you want to put this in the hands of the people, or do you want to put this in the hands of Big Pharma?
For sure. And, because it's such a new, I wouldn't say new industry, because, it's been around forever, right? But because we've got this so-called fresh start, because we're now migrating. Formalized. Yeah, because it's being formalized. We have this opportunity to, from the get-go, vote, like you said, again, like you reminded me, with your wallet. Because we can then guide the way that this unfolds, whereas it's much more difficult to do with established industries, right? But this being what it is right now, we have that opportunity, and I would recommend people really realize what that means and seize that, even if it's just for a social experiment to see how we might be able to affect commodity chains, and community developments and focuses, why not? What have you got to lose, except maybe hard work, but yeah, that's democracy.
Etienne, I just want to say from our side, a really, really big thank you. You've been extremely generous with your time. And for the record, I'll state here that we did a recording on this a week ago, and we had some technical issues, and I lost that entire video. And you were generous enough to reshoot the video and sit here with me again to discuss the bill and share your valuable insights. It goes an extremely long way, and it means a lot to us. I just want to lastly ask you, is there any way in which our viewers, if they're busy watching this right now, that they can support you in your research efforts or contribute towards the work that you are doing? Is there any way in which they can support?
Well, sure. Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity, and it's a pleasure to retake this again, because I find that community education is very important. In terms of support, I do consult in this space, and it's something that I have a passion for. So I guess I'll give you those details to put it somewhere on the screen or something, where if people want, they can reach out for consultation on this. And yeah, we will take it from there. There are other projects in the pipeline, and I think we'll talk about this some more. at a later stage to maybe publish something where, crowdfunding I found is very necessary in the drug policy space, and particularly cannabis, because it's not something that's a priority for the state to pay for, right? They just want to shelve it and ignore it as a problem it's not high priority, right? So if we want any kind of real change according to what we need and what we know to be reasonable, we're going to have to fund this ourselves. Which it's sad, but at the same time, if we do finance these kinds of interventions ourselves, it means the amount of control we're able to to have over processes and shaping arguments and so on remains much more our own as well. So there's a potential benefit there. So I would recommend people to really consider that, and where we are in terms of formulating a fair framework for cannabis that includes a broad-based development and empowerment paradigm for all members of the cannabis community, right? To consciously invest in projects that make sense for you, and that you see will actually have the benefits that you want to see come from those kinds of projects. So yeah, again, but there'll be more communications on that later. I hope.
Sure, of course.
And yeah, crowdfund away, guys. Like really, it doesn't necessarily cost much, but it can go a long ways to helping you and your community at the end of the day.
So yeah, to our viewers, if you want to get in touch with Etienne, as he just mentioned, he is available for consultation. So we'll just add his details in the description so you can reach out to him directly. And thank you very much for your time today. I think it was great to have those insights again. And ek dink ons het dit die keer pragtig gedoen. I'm hoping that we get this chance again in the future to discuss future matters, and it's been a massive privilege for us to have you here on the channel. Thanks, Etienne.
Sure, thanks, man. Yeah, again, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope we can take this conversation forward, because it's not going to just become less of a priority soon. We're going to have to keep chipping away at it. So yeah, let's pursue this.